Hello and welcome to this debrief of the September 22 AAA exam, the variant of the exam that's been published by the examiner, and you can access it on the ACCA's practice platform and do it yourself before sitting your actual exam. It's great practice because these are excellent questions that are written by the examiner that reflect their latest style, and they build in the 20 professional skills marks. Now, in this video, we're going to be reviewing the exam paper. That's a small part of it. And the big focus, the big push is on the professional skills. And I'm going to be honing in here on where you could have earned the professional skills in each requirement. Stop though. If you haven't sat the September 22 exam already on the ACCA practice platform and had a go at it yourself, stop here and go and do that paper and then come back and watch this recording. You'll get the most out of it if you're really familiar with these questions, having worked them yourself already. So the first question that came up on the September 22 exam was called Winbury. And we're going to start by going through the requirements. If you want to read them fully, pause the recording so you can do so. Now, Winbury, I would describe this as a pretty standard question one. You had to do briefing notes, well, we always do, so there's going to be format marks. And we were told how to calculate materiality based on profit before tax. So this was a bog standard question one. Briefing notes with risks in the first part, some procedures, and something sort of ethics related in part D. Now, in part A, B, and C, they used words like significant and principal, which is the examiner's way of saying they only want you to include important points. If you include fringe or irrelevant points, you're not going to score for them, so no technical marks, and it's going to cost you a professional skills mark for not answering the specific question that's been asked. So if there are risks in this scenario, let's say a small business risk, don't put them. Or if there are risks of material misstatement that don't matter because they've been mitigated by another factor in the scenario, don't put them. Now, the verb in part A and part B is evaluate, as it so often is in this AAA exam. The examiner loves that verb. What does it mean? Well, it means you need some pretty significant depth if you're going to be scoring fully. Business risks are 2 marks per point. Risk of material misstatement are 3 marks per well-explained point, just like audit risks. But to earn those 2 or 3 marks, you have to fully develop your point, linking together different facts from the scenario, really going to town on what they mean. So an evaluate point needs 2 or 3 sentences at least to develop it fully. Now, in part B, in the risk of material misstatement, the examiner specifically said you need to prioritize your points. And what that means, you have to take your top 2 risks and explain why they're most significant based on their size or the probability or likelihood that they are actually incorrect. Now, in the examiner's comments from September 22, the examiner said that hardly any students actually did this. And they missed out on technical marks for their explanations and a professional skills mark for judgment as well. So make sure you do that. Now, in part C, this audit procedures question, it was really specific, talking about classification of this joint venture investment. And so you would only get marks for things that help you decide whether or not it's a joint venture. Anything like, let's assess the cost of the investment by checking to the bank statements for how much was paid for it. That's going to score 0 because that's not about classification. That's about the cost of the investment. So you had to be really precise. Only things that help you to decide whether or not it was a joint venture. And in this last question, which was about laws and regulations, the sort of ethics one about data protection, well, some students might have approached this by just listing out what they know about laws and regulations, and they'd only have scored a couple of marks. Because this question, look, it's asking you to refer to this issue for this company. And so you had to use the scenario to apply your knowledge if you were going to score a higher mark. Right, that's the review of question 1. I thought it was pretty fair, and actually quite a reasonable question. We're now going to focus on the professional skills marks that you could have earned in this question 1, because there would be 10 professional skills marks available. Now, as we go through this, you might do the adding up and see it comes to more than 10. And that's because there's a bit of headroom in the professional skills. There's more than 10 marks available, but it's capped at 10 marks in question 1. So the communication marks, these ones should be home bankers. No matter what the question is in question 1, these communication marks are for the same thing every time. Firstly, having the right format and structure. So that's having a title for briefing notes, having headings for each part of the question, A, B, C, D, and having subheadings under each, and having a brief introduction that summarizes the requirements. If you want to see what a good introduction looks like, you can see my debrief videos that are available on YouTube where I go through the first question of the exam paper. That's not for this paper, that's for the pre-December 22 mock, or the pre-mock for whichever paper you're sitting. Then the second communication mark is for professionalism, having an appropriate style, language, and clarity to your answer. So that means, you see, it's going to be delivered, these briefing notes, to an audit partner. And so your language has to be professional, the right sort of tone. And you had to, crucially, have a materiality paragraph at the start of your risk and material misstatement, titled materiality, where you do your calculation of the range, then set your materiality at 5, 7.5, or 10, or whatever you think it is, and you justify it. Then the third professional skills mark, effectiveness. This one is for making sure that you make tailored points, so that you use the scenario effectively to answer the question. And the last one is for following any specific questions in any specific instructions in the question. So do your materiality based on profit. You only evaluate significant points in your risk and material misstatement and your business risks. Okay. Oh, and actually, the other thing I was getting at, the fact it's only risk and material misstatement, is that you don't include audit things that are detection risks, because anything that is a detection risk doesn't fall under risk of material misstatement. That would only be applicable if it was an audit risk question. Analysis and evaluation, that's what the second set of professional skills marks are for. And there were 3 marks available here in question 1. The first one, well, because it's an evaluate question, you had to use the information in the scenario to do some little calculations. Small percentage changes. You don't have to do loads and loads of calculations, but 3 or 4 simple calculations to add some depth to your analysis. Not only will you get half a mark for each calculation you do, and crucially, that you also discuss, you also get a professional skills mark for using those numbers too. Then it was asking about prioritizing the significant risks of material misstatement. So you got a professional skills mark for prioritizing, so having your top 2 and explaining why, and only including significant risks. Any that had been mitigated by another factor in the scenario. If you put one of those in, I think there was one about foreign exchange in this question, then you wouldn't have scored this professional skills mark. And the third one was related to part D of the question, with this discussion about laws and regulations. You needed to have a balanced appraisal, saying that some of this stuff isn't really the auditor's responsibility. The company has responsibility under data protection, not just and the auditor's role is not to make sure the company's doing the right thing, it's to plan procedures that would identify if they've breached any of the regulations. And because it's a discuss question, anytime you see the word discuss as the verb in the requirement, it's telling you they want you to write a conclusion. So having a justified conclusion here would have helped you to get that professional skills mark. Next up, skepticism and judgment. Notice 5 marks available. This is the most important professional skill in the AAA exam. So how can you earn these marks? Well, in this part B, when you were prioritizing your significant risks of material misstatement, you had to challenge management on how they had accounted for things. And I've given a couple of examples there. So in some places they'd accounted for things incorrectly, like not writing down the electric vehicles, the way they'd accounted for the joint venture. And about the legal claim, you needed to kind of develop your point and say, actually, I don't know everything here that I need to know. It would be useful to have further information, perhaps correspondence with the legal team, so that I could fully assess this risk. Next, around this being based on PBT, you had to not just calculate materiality, doing your 5 to 10% range. You had to justify it, setting it at 5, 7.5, or 10. By the way, you could have set it at any of those. Any is fine, as long as you used a fact from the scenario to support why it's either low or high. And critically, the second little bullet point there, you had to go on and apply your materiality level throughout the risk section, the risk and material misstatement section. If you get materiality right, it's a source of really easy marks. 2 marks for the calculation for your range, 1 for your kind of justification of should it be high or low, and then another 1 for applying it through the question. One of those is a professional skills mark that I've just talked about here, the application of it, and the other 3 are technical marks. Then around part B being an evaluate question, we have whenever you're assessing the risk question, so be it audit risk or risk of material misstatement, you've got to look for places where there could be management bias and explain why there might be management bias. So here they had to maintain a certain level of interest cover to as part of the kind of loan covenant. Now, you can use that as a good development or linking point onto any of your other risks where management have perhaps been biased to say, well, the reason they might be biased here is because they're trying to maintain a certain level of interest cover to meet that criteria. It's also a good idea in question 1 to comment on things that are missing. So we didn't know enough information about, well, the joint venture. We didn't know whether it had been audited or not. And that's a really important bit of information. And commenting on it and saying that was missing, we need to know it, would have earned you a professional skills mark for skepticism. So 3 and 4 there are really good ones that you can use in any question 1. Look for places that management are biased and comment on why they are and use it to assess an audit risk or risk of material misstatement, and comment on 1 or 2 things that are missing that you would like to know. The final one was in relation to part D of the question, where you had to use your knowledge of GDPR, you had to use your knowledge of the no-CLAR regulations and what the auditor is supposed to do. So applying your knowledge of regulations would have earned you this professional skills mark. And an example of how you could have done it, the audit committee, by allowing this breach of laws and regulations to take place, it suggests that the audit committee is not functional. Right, the final professional skills mark in question 1, or marks, are around commercial acumen. And well, for these notes that we were given, you had to use those notes to do calculations, to quote specific facts that can be relevant to your answer, and considering linkages between the different pieces of information. And by using the scenario information effectively, you would have earned a commercial acumen point. And when it came to the business risks facing the company, there was a professional skills mark under commercial acumen for considering the wider implications of the company's strategies. So one of the things we were told in this question is that this joint venture company is going to use the existing assets of the company, its distribution center. And, well, you could have earned this professional skills mark by saying, well, if the joint venture is going to use it, our distribution center, it's going to get really busy. It's perhaps not going to be able to deal with my existing customers as well. And so thinking about the implication of factors in the scenario on the company's key stakeholders, like its customers, is going to help you to earn that business risk commercial acumen mark. It's a point worth noting that I'm expecting to see business risks coming up more often in question 1 now. I'd say in at least half of the exam variants, I'm expecting to see it. The reason being that it allows them to bring in this commercial acumen professional skills mark. It's something that the examiner has flagged. On to question 2 now from the September 22 exam, and this was called Magnolia. So looking at the requirement, again, you can pause the recording if you want to read through it fully. One big question for 20 marks. And my heart sinks a little bit when I see a question like this, because if a student goes down the wrong route with it, they don't score many marks. Whereas if it's kind of 3 short scenarios, I tend to prefer those, because if you mess one up, well, the other 2 can save you. But although it looks like one question, the examiner is up to one of their tricks here. How many questions can you see there? Well, when I go through this, There's definitely one question around evaluating the quality management of the engagement. So not how well it's been done, but how well it's been managed from a quality perspective. Secondly, other professional matters that we pick out in the review. And thirdly, recommending appropriate actions to be taken. And importantly, these points need to relate to both the planning, so how we plan to do the work, and how we actually did it, the performance of this audit. So these multiple requirements mean you have to have a structure. And that structure should link back to the requirements. And this question is set at the completion phase. We're told that in the kind of background information to this scenario. So your comments have to be relevant to the phase of the audit we're at. The examiner's really hot on this. It's something they've commented on a lot in their recent examiner's comments, that students often ignore the phase of the audit and make comments that aren't particularly relevant. So when it comes to actions, our actions have to be things that are going to help us to sign off the audit report, because that's the phase that we're at. So suggesting things like, I don't know, training so that we get better for future audits, that's not going to be relevant, because that's not helpful to signing off this audit report at this point. Right, the focus now is going to be on how you could have earned the 5 professional skills marks that were available in question 2. So 2 of those marks were for analysis and evaluation. And well, we're told in the question stem, matters identified in respect of the planning and performance of the audit. And so you had to use examples from the scenario to assess whether the quality management of the audit had been effective or not. But everything had to be based on facts and examples from the scenario. And if you did that, you'll have earned this professional skills mark. On these actions, they had to be appropriate to the completion phase. As I already mentioned in my little intro there, they can't be general, wider recommendations. They have to be things that are either getting more evidence or perhaps reporting to those charged with governance, but things that are appropriate to the completion phase. On skepticism and judgment, I thought it'd be a bit more helpful to show you the scenario a bit more here, so I can show you some of the points that I'm thinking of here. Now, if you want to read through that scenario, pause the recording here, but we're just going to pick out a few key points from it. So the audit partner said, we don't need to do any audit work on this acquisition. And the audit partner, and we were told that the junior just agreed these assumptions to the business plan and agreed that they were consistent. Now, you could have earned a professional skills mark for challenging what had been done here. So why didn't we do any audit work? Maybe that's to do with the engagement partner having too close a relationship, or there not being enough time. And that we're overly relying on client evidence. That's in the second of my highlights here. We just agreed it to internal information, the group business plan, and that's potentially biased. It's not robust third-party evidence. So we'd need to be getting things like market research to help to support the assumptions in the business plan. Here in this paragraph, we were told there were cost pressures. We wanted to reduce the cost of the audit. And you would have scored credit under skepticism and judgment here for questioning that. You know, we should be getting enough evidence to support the conclusions of the audit, not just trying to reduce the cost of it. Yes, every audit has to work within a budget, but that cannot be at the expense of gathering enough evidence, which it seems in this audit they didn't gather enough evidence, and linking it back to the reason why they didn't gather enough evidence was to reduce the cost of the audit, and questioning that as an approach would have earned you a professional skills mark. Next up, commercial acumen. Here there was 1 mark available for commercial awareness, and a nice place you could have earned that is thinking about that cost pressure and developing your point. Potentially here, if we're trying to reduce the cost of the audit, it might be because we have negotiated a fee that's too low, lowballing, and that's not allowing us enough scope to do the work that's required to fully gather evidence to support our conclusions. Here in this paragraph about another subsidiary increasing the group's revenue by about 20%. And well, this is therefore a growing business. Wonderful. But that means that I might be trying to retain the audit and offering them a cheap price at the minute so that I can earn nice, juicy audit fees in the future. On to the third question, which was Bing from the September 22 exam. And if you don't get the relevance of that picture, well, you probably don't have a young person, a small person in your life. My daughter absolutely loved Bing. Great TV program. One of those that as an adult you can probably quite enjoy as well. Right, on to looking at the questions. So the examiner often tests questions like this, right? They come up regularly, where we're having to look at a cash flow forecast or some other kind of client-produced document. The examiner loves it because each question is really, really bespoke. The details are really different. So it's not one where if you've done a previous question like this, you can memorize the answer. In fact, none of AAA is like that. But anyway, the scenario information will be different every time, and you have to respond to the specific scenario information. So in part A, and well, we were told here that we were supposed to use specific exhibits in part A and part B. So only exhibits 1 and 2. And that's something the examiner is doing more and more, telling you to use specific exhibits for specific parts of the question. And so if you used one of the other exhibits, so I think there was only one other one, exhibit 3, then you wouldn't have scored credit. In fact, I'm not sure there was another exhibit here. Actually, I don't think there was. But I wanted to make that point because particularly actually in question 1 recently, we're seeing them saying that specific exhibits only should be used. So only use those, follow the instructions. This question A, you had to evaluate the assumptions. You had to say whether it was complete or not, the cash flow, so what's missing. And therefore, you had to have a structure where you went through the assumptions and then had a section that was anything that's missing, completeness of the cash flow statement. And they particularly highlighted professional skepticism here. That's something they've not really done in the past. So they're highlighting how important that's going to be for earning your professional skills marks. When we're evaluating the assumptions and saying why particular assumptions should be challenged, there's that clear steer on skepticism. The examiner is saying, I'm giving you skepticism marks here, make sure you try and earn them by questioning with authority. And on the completeness of the cash flow forecast, that's examiner speak for tell me things that are missing that you would expect to see in here. In part B, you had to get audit evidence about the cash receipts, or you had to explain the evidence you would expect to find there already. And notice the tense that's been used. Here, the procedure should already have been done. So we're at the review phase here, and we should say this stuff should already be on file. Rather than go out and get this evidence, it should be this evidence should already be there. It's a subtle point, but it's helping you to make sure you answer the specific question. And then in the next part of the question, we're fast forwarding in time. And that's something the examiner does every now and again, but it's important you take that into account. We've now fast forwarded in time and we've got to assess the audit report. And we've got to discuss whether it's appropriate or not. So there's going to be things that are decent about it, and there's going to definitely be things that aren't. So you've got to kind of argue both, and then have a kind of justified conclusion about whether it is appropriate and what actually should the audit opinion be within that audit report. Focusing now on the professional skills marks you could have earned in question 3, and as we know from looking at the requirement, lots of them, well, there's going to be some for skepticism. But firstly, analysis and evaluation. And here again, I've brought up an extract from the scenario to aid this section. If you want to pause the recording, and read through that section, you'll probably find it helpful to do so. So where are the analysis and evaluation marks here? Well, for example, in these financial issues, we were told that they have a bank loan that is due for repayment. And you had to use that fact, that wider fact, to help you to assess the going concern of the business. If we've got to pay back this 5 million bank loan, we're going to need to be generating enough cash to be able to repay it. And are we? Or have they been creating a cash flow forecast that is overly biased to make sure they hit that target so it looks good to the bank? Another thing we were told in the scenario is they've recently acquired a digital publishing business. But in the cash flow forecast, there's nothing for integration costs for the new division. That's something that's missing. So you had to use that fact from the scenario. There's a new company here, but there's no costs in there for around integrating it. In the cash flow forecast as well, there's nothing in there for dividends, which is something we'd expect this business to be paying. You had to go on and make suitable recommendations within here about how you could have acquired this information. That would have earned you analysis and evaluation marks. On the skepticism and judgment, this is obviously highlighted in the scenario or in the requirement as being particularly important. One area that you could have shown skepticism is by saying where the numbers and the words don't make sense. So here, it clearly says that in previous years, revenue has fallen, right? Fallen by 10%, fallen by 12%. But then in the cash flow forecast that they have prepared, it says that the cash receipts are forecast to grow. And so you can earn a professional skepticism mark for saying that, well, given that they fell by 10% and 12% over the last few years, revenue, seems really unlikely that things are going to turn around so quickly. Actually, we'd expect cash receipts to be falling in line with the trend. In part B of the question, which was discuss the appropriateness of the audit report, you got a specific mark for concluding on the required audit opinion. So if you're going to go for an except for opinion, stating what that is, that the accounts are true and fair, free from material misstatement, except for this particular matter. So that's a qualified audit opinion. Under commercial acumen, there was 1 mark available for developing wider implications. So we were told this fact here that the company is delaying making royalty payments to some of its authors. And you get a commercial acumen point for running with that a bit. You know, you might go on and say, well, if you're going to pay these authors late, well, you're in breach of contract potentially. They might sue you. Or there could be late payment fees in the contract. Or it might be that the authors say, well, if you're going to pay me slowly, I'm going to take my books elsewhere. A loss of goodwill with those particular authors. So that's one way you could have developed it from the company's perspective. But you also could have gone down a slightly different route and said, if they're going to be paying the authors late, they might also pay me late. You know, they're clearly struggling for cash and looking for where they can squeeze some free credit out of suppliers. And I'm a supplier. I might lose out here too. So developing your points and thinking about the commercial implication on wider stakeholders like these authors and like the audit firm is going to help you to earn commercial acumen marks. I hope you found that session useful. Thanks for your attention. Best of luck for your exam as you're sitting it. And well, you'll have seen my QR code popping up throughout this presentation. If you want to get in touch because you want support with AAA, scan the QR code and get in touch with me. But best of luck for your exam.